A surprising yet tragic effect of the recent California wildfires, and incredibly relevant for our readings today, is the impact on grapes. Many California vineyards are reporting that this year's grapes have been damaged by the smoke from the fires. Even if the fire does not enter the vineyard, the smoke in the air can be absorbed into the grapes and result in sour or bitter wine. As a result, entire crops are being left out to rot, unharvested and worthless. Our first reading speaks of wild grapes, but this is a bad translation. A better word would be stinky, smelly, or odious grapes. Isaiah presents this image of stinky grapes to a people that would be aware, as many California vineyard owners are now, of the tragedy of watching an entire season's worth of grapes rot because they are stinky. There is no doubt here as to who the vineyard represents. Toward the end of the reading and in our psalm it says, "The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel." In this case, it is Israel right before the Babylonian exile. Isaiah was clear. Israel had been bearing smelly fruit. The reading ends with the line, "The Lord looked for judgment, but see bloodshed. For justice, but hark, the outcry." The word outcry is found throughout scriptures as the cry of the poor and the oppressed to God, the cry of those who have nowhere else to turn. The sins against those victims are the sins that cry out to heaven. And while this passage is a metaphor presenting Israel as a vineyard, the second half gets surprisingly literal, because Israel was soon to be trampled. When the Babylonians took the city, the temple was destroyed and the city was left in ruins. By the time of Jesus, the Jewish people had returned and rebuilt, and yet, once again, their sins cried out to heaven. Jesus resurrects this metaphor and puts a more personal spin on things, casting the prophets as the servants of the master, sent to ensure the vineyard was producing. And he rightly casts himself as the son of the landowner. Sadly, the chief priests and the elders fail to see that they are speaking about themselves when they say, "He will put those wretched men to a wretched death." Brothers and sisters, our country, like Israel in the time of Isaiah and in the time of Christ, is producing smelly grapes. We're producing grapes that reek. And the dark cloud of smoke poisoning what should be our fruit is the cloud that Pope St. John Paul II called the culture of death. This weekend each year is Respect Life Sunday, and it is meant to serve as a reminder of the importance of standing up for the truth that all human life is sacred, from conception to natural death. And the victims of those who refuse to recognize this truth join their voices to countless others throughout history, crying out to heaven for justice. Some estimate that over 3,000 unborn children are dying from abortion in the United States every single day. Since Roe v. Wade, over 60 million unborn children have been killed in our country. Padre Pio offers an important reminder in the face of this tragedy. He said, "The day that people lose their horror for abortion will be the most terrible day for humanity." Our response needs a bit of balancing. On one hand, we never need to settle. We should never accept this as normal or unavoidable or unchangeable. And we should recognize the scale of the challenge we face to restore a culture of life. But on the other hand, we should not walk around feeling hopeless or helpless. Padre Pio also summarized Paul's advice today in his letter, in his famous saying, "Pray, hope, and don't worry." That is at the heart of what St. Paul says today. Brothers and sisters, have no anxiety at all, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. And we have to remember, the Roman society the Philippians were living in was also producing their fair share of smelly grapes. The challenges we face today are not new for those in God's vineyard. And it comes as no surprise that we got our start with some bad fruit in an otherwise perfect garden. Any one of us alone cannot single-handedly change the culture of our country. But this past week, we celebrated Saint Therese of Lisieux, who knew that it was the smallest acts of love that through God's grace could have the biggest impact on the world. First and foremost, we need prayer and fasting. Prayer that not only helps us grow in personal holiness, but prayer that calls out to God, the true source of justice and mercy. Second, we need to stand up for life in the public square, not belligerently, but courageously, adamantly, and lovingly. And this year in particular, we need a nota bene about our involvement in political life in our country. Christ was clear about our calling to be good citizens, and for us that means informing our conscience, learning about our options, prayerfully considering and voting. And on intrinsic moral evils like abortion, the Church is clear. Given the choice, if we vote for a candidate who supports such an evil, specifically because they support it, our souls are in mortal danger. Third, we need to help make the world more conducive to new human life, both in general by leading a virtuous life, and in particular by helping to support pregnancy resource centers, supporting women who are pregnant, and especially supporting those who have had abortions, that they might experience God's mercy, healing, and love. And finally, we return to St. Paul, who reminds us to cling to whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, and gracious. And I think J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, can finish Paul's thought here. Tolkien wrote, "Out of the darkness of my life so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves on earth." These methods are exactly what the Philippians and every other early Christian community used to change the Roman Empire forever. And they are exactly what we need now, so that, as our psalm says, the God of hosts might restore us, might shine his face upon us, that we might be saved.